Welcome back to the Animal Highlight, everyone. This is the last episode of season 4, where we've been looking at animals and waste. And if you've been following along this season, we've looked at everything from pigeons and how they've grappled with stringfoot, worms and their relationships with composting, house finches and how they're looking at and using cigarette butts, fiddler crabs and the ways in which they shape ecosystems, sea turtles and their relationship to plastic, macaques and how they navigate urban areas, as well as wild boars and some of their entanglements with nuclear waste. It's been a jam-packed season. Herre has done a brilliant job, I think, of bringing together and forward a whole range of ideas related to waste and how animals are connected with waste in a super accessible and interesting way. I very much enjoyed working with Herre as a fellow at the Animal Turn and at the Animal Highlight. He's been an absolute joy to work with, and I'm sad to see him go. But it's very exciting. This is our first, as I mentioned at the start of the season, our first independent season that's kind of a bit independent of the Animal Turn. So very, very exciting. Well done, Herre, for your incredible season. It was great to work with you. Also, a big congratulations and a thank you to Rebecca Shen for her amazing artwork. If you've been paying attention to the season posters, you'll see that they look very cool. And if you head over to the Animal Turn website, you'll see that it's also featuring a whole bunch of Rebecca's sketches. They're amazing. I absolutely love them, and I hope you love them too. Now, this last episode, instead of focusing in on a specific animal, we're doing a little bit of a review. Rebecca joins myself and Herre on the show, and together we talk about some of the key themes and ideas that emerged over the last 7 episodes and what we've kind of gathered about animals and waste and their various relationships. I hope you enjoy it. So, Herre, welcome back to the Animal Highlight, and Rebecca, welcome onto the show.
Hi, both.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's get started. This episode is going to primarily be trying to, I think, tie together some of the themes and maybe gaps and opportunities that have come up over the course of this season. So if I remember correctly, Herre, the whole season was focused on animals and waste. What inspired you to look at waste again? Why are we even talking about waste?
Yeah, good question. I think we talked about that in the first episode as well. I think I find animal agency fascinating in general. I think I love it when animals just do something that we don't expect, and how they keep surprising us by defying our categorizations, basically. And this would be in what you can see yourself, but also, I mean, if you see a video of a seagull stealing a sandwich in a shop or something, of course, it makes you go, haha, seagull is stealing a sandwich, so funny. But at the same time, it can also make you ask questions like, is this good for the seagull? Why are they doing this? What inspired them to do this? Is this a habit? Is this like a local seagull that just goes there every day? Or like, what is theft even? Does it need money? All these questions just start rolling in. And I think waste specifically, I find interesting there because those specific interactions that animals have with waste kind of show us how waste is a bit of a weird category. We call something waste when it's like, when it has limited value, I suppose less exchange value, maybe some use value, but not for the person who throws it away. But then animals end up interacting with them and bringing them back into our view. Very interesting way, very unexpected often as well.
Yeah, I think that was a key theme throughout your season was, I mean, waste is a really powerful signifier. It can be used as a metaphor. You can think about a life being wasted. That came up for me in many of your episodes, thinking about the turtles, for example, being impacted by plastic, how life can be wasted by waste as well. But also this kind of tension between threat and resource. So how waste can be a threat to some animals. And depending on the waste and the animal you're looking at, it can also be a resource. If you switch to the vantage of the animal's point of view, and of course this kind of resource thinking makes me think of the worms, right? And how what we just think of as discarded food or waste for them is an entire meal or life world, which is just remarkable, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah, for the worms, it really is a resource, and then how they almost upcycle something and turn it into a resource for us again, because we can then use their fertilizer that they create by eating it. And then, and as we say that, it also makes me think, it kind of, we're using those worms, we're almost domesticating them. Although, if you want to get into the definition of domestication, I'm not sure if they would be domesticated. Anyway,
That's a big
yeah,
can of worms, opening up
exactly.
the domestication. Yeah, domestication is a lot more tricky than what it appears on face, on face value, on the face of it. What is or is not domesticated. It definitely involves breeding practices, and I think there are instances of worms being actively bred, or at least selected, right? So it was tiger worms that were primarily being used for this. It was tiger worms, right? Primarily being
Yeah,
used for the
I
very
think so.
composting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
exactly.
Rebecca, did you? So you listened to all of these. You haven't. Hera and I've been working together on them for months, so we both kind of know what's potting. But you listened to these as a series, and what jumped out to you? What jumped out to you in listening to this season?
Yeah, I absolutely love listening to your season, Herre. I just thought you expanded my perspective on waste so much, and the variety of ways that you thought about waste and their relationship with animals was very different from what I expected. So often I would think of waste as only having a negative impact on animals, and more, human waste having a negative impact on animals. But I didn't necessarily think about the reverse, animal waste and how it impacts us, or even how our waste is positively or, beneficial to animals. One of the episodes that really struck me was the last one about the boars in the exclusion zone after the Fukushima nuclear power plant abandonment, because I've seen something like this. There's actually a ranch there as well called the Ranch of Hope, and it's a sanctuary for cows. So there were a lot of farmers who had to abandon their cows after that disaster. But actually, those cows are doing okay. They're actually not sent to slaughter because they were able to, or because they're not allowed to go to market. So just like the wild boars that you said that are thriving now that humans are gone, the cows there have also been saved by this terrible human disaster. So that was really profound to me. Just
That's super
thinking about,
interesting. Sorry, so the cows are in a sanctuary though. So unlike
yes,
the boars that are relatively free roaming,
right.
the cows have kind of been kept safe as well.
Yes. So it's actually a formal cattle rancher who is now in charge of the sanctuary. And of course, no one can actually inhabit, or no human can actually inhabit the exclusion zone. So this sanctuary tender is now just going back and forth between his home and the exclusion zone to take care of these cows. So I just think it's fascinating that something that you would think is so disastrous to animals as well as humans, such as this, nuclear contaminant, is actually benefiting both wild and domesticated animals in a variety of ways. So, yeah,
Mm.
I just really appreciate the variety in which now I'm thinking about waste. And yeah, just thank you for sharing all the topics and all the research you did here.
Yeah, you're welcome. This cow thing that you mentioned is it's almost a bit sad that the cows almost needed a nuclear disaster to be extracted from the exploitative system that they were in. Because I assume even if they give milk, I assume that's not going to be for consumption either. So suddenly the whole context with which we usually hold cows, which is
Mm.
for human consumption one way or another, just is irrelevant. And yeah, they can just be. That's kind of beautiful.
That raises another, I think, core theme that came up throughout the season is value, right? So whether it's cow's milk or flesh, the kind of connections between waste and value seemed to be pronounced throughout the season. How we value items, whether it's something that we view as valuable to purchase and then discard, but also how animals value items, which is, I think, what you were speaking a bit about. Is there's this kind of tension between waste and value. And so often we think of value only in like capitalist terms. Can I buy it? Can I sell it? But actually value is a lot more pronounced and diverse than that, right? So like the house finches, for example, their ability to, they clearly value for medical or life reasons those cigarette butts. The idea that they find value in something that we discard is quite attractive. And I think what you did really well in that episode was to just highlight how, one, how there might be gendered implications or sexual implications for the animals, how it's primarily female finches that are dealing with these cigarette butts. And if there are any health implications, it would overtly impact them a lot more. But also the interconnections of human health and animal health, and how urban policies can change things. So an urban policy comes by and says no more smoking in cities. That can have big implications for animals who have a different kind of value attached to what we think of as waste and what they think of as a resource, right?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, you mentioned the policy there, and I think that's a crucial point, especially when it comes to the cigarette butts. And I mean, I wonder what's going to happen to the house finches. Maybe they're going to be infested with endoparasites suddenly. I hope not. And similarly, we can bring that to the episode of plastic, where with the turtles who just end up getting tangled in plastic, having straws in their noses, forks in their noses as well. I've seen a video of, and how policy definitely has the capacity to change those things as well. So it does remind us that our policy matters, which also I guess ties into your research yourself, Claudia.
Yeah, it sounded a bit like a broken record. I can't help but be like, policy, guys, it matters. Even if it feels like it doesn't matter sometimes, because we all break the rules in many varied ways, I think. I think policy creates opportunities to act and forecloses some opportunities to act for humans and animals. And yeah, it's just, I really appreciated how thinking, and you spoke about many urban animals, right? You spoke about pigeons and house finches. And of course, my brain just goes to thinking about whether the cities are thinking at all about how their policies about something that seems completely unrelated, like smoking, might impact these birds. And this is not to say, of course, that I now want cities to keep allowing smoking everywhere in the city so that house finches have access to cigarette butts, but more a matter of making sure that, for example, the tobacco plant is more readily available. Or maybe there's a design element here, Rebecca. Like maybe there's a design element where something needs to be available to these birds so that they can carry out weaving this material into their nests to protect themselves. I mean, that's an exciting thought. But anyway, it's interesting.
Yeah. Value came up for me a lot as well throughout listening to the season, but not just the value of the waste itself, but how animals are valued based on how they interact with that waste.
Mm-hmm.
So you brought up the turtle and how stories really matter. And, these sea turtles you were talking about are probably one of the most charismatic animals when it comes to conservation, and how fast we were able to respond to that one viral video of the, straw getting stuck in the turtle's nose. And, you brought up greenwashing, and it's, how much easier it is for a company to switch to from plastic straws to paper straws versus actually removing filet-o-fish from their menu, for example. But, I also thought about animals' values when it comes to their waste when, during the worm season, because it feels like we only value worms based on how they are able to produce waste. And I also thought about, well, what comes afterward? Would the worms' bodies themselves just be considered waste as well to us after they perform their function? And of course, the fiddler crab episode, how, they're considered keystone species and important only because of how they are able to recycle waste within the mangrove forest ecosystem, while other animals who might not be able to, such as invasive animals, who also are sentient beings, are not valued at all because their waste is actually harmful to whatever ecosystems they're not belonging to. So that was something that came up for me in particular, was how an animal produces or interacts with waste is also very, that's how we ascribe value to them in many ways.
Yeah, there are these value judgments kind of built into, or assumptions built into different interactions. That's a really good point. Herre?
Yeah. No. Yeah. I agree. I completely agree. It's as if their value depends on the extent to which they can be of use to us. Like their value is our values, basically. And sometimes that's used as well. I mean, like you're saying, the turtle. I think ecologists call those keystone species when they use a specific species and say, you should care about this animal. Turtles are cool. So give us money for give turtles money basically, but then the money is also going to all the species that live in the same ecology as those turtles. So sometimes it actually does end up bringing having value as well when we do care about these animals.
I mean, there's keystone species and there's also ecosystem engineers. And I think all of these types of concepts, nature-based solutions. So often these concepts are used and the animals kind of get lost, I think, a little bit or invisibilized a bit behind the service that they supposedly function. And I think to Rebecca's point, it's like, how do we value animals outside of these, waste relations? It's not to say that those aren't valuable, but worms exist beyond their ability to do vermicomposting, and turtles exist beyond their capacity or their value as ecosystem engineers, right? They are also being hurt by this plastic. They're being hurt in these kinds of wasteful relationships. Because, of course, there's also the amount of waste that humans produce. But to Rebecca's kind of point also about how waste and our value of animals is kind of entangled with how we think about waste is the episode of macaques made me think a bit differently. Like macaques were not so much. Wait, I need to backtrack. Macaques also had this they were also differently valued based on how they interacted with waste, but this was very much geographical as well. It was where the waste was that shaped how people thought about the waste. And there were conflicting ideas here. So unlike many of the other episodes you presented, it seemed like macaques, there was a fair bit of tension with regards to whether or not they are valued by humans or not, right? Sorry, that was garbled. I was all over the show there. I hope that made some sense.
It did make sense. I think it kind of reiterates what the episode was about certain kinds of behavior are acceptable in certain kinds of places. And eating and making waste is allowed in the forest, whereas it's not allowed in a residential neighborhood, especially not if it means toppling a garbage bin, for example. And thinking about that episode, I was preparing for this episode thinking, what if I actually said in all these episodes? And I thought back to the animal turn episode on politics that talked about Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka's work on politics with animals, for animals, and
by animals.
By animals, thank you. Yes, I definitely knew that. And I was thinking, what are these monkeys doing here? Is this actually politics by animals, with the monkeys rummaging through bins, forcing people to kind of deal with them and changing the bins, maybe changing public spaces, changing how they interact with spaces?
I certainly think there is politics by the animals also in terms of how they sometimes have conflicts over those resources, right? Like they have different understandings about what is valuable and who should have access to it, regardless of what humans think, right? That's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so when I think about animals and waste, and throughout your season, I've also, you mentioned many really interesting animals throughout your season. You spoke about pigeons, worms, house finches, fiddler crabs, sea turtles, macaques, and wild boars, all of whom we've already discussed somewhat here. And based on our conversation so far, some core themes that have come up are, value, the ways in which animals are valued, waste is valued, and the relationship between animals and waste is valued. This kind of tension between waste being seen as a threat or a resource to animals and for animals. And just that in general, waste is this really powerful signifier, but it's also material. Waste actually exists in the world, right? It impacts turtles, it impacts pigeons. They are hurt by waste and they use waste slash a resource, as in the case of macaques or fiddler crabs or worms. But I couldn't help reflect on animals in my life and the waste relationships we have. And of course, Linus comes to mind for me immediately. And I think about his pee. Man, I can't tell you how much I think about his pee. You walk through the city. Vienna's a relatively clean city, and you don't see a lot of waste in general. And there's pretty strict laws and rules about picking up poop, and not everyone does. But just the politics of poop amongst dog owners is insane. So you speak about politics with and by. It makes me think about politics. It's almost outside of the dogs. The dogs don't care about where their poop is. I mean, no, they probably do. They probably have very serious ideas about where their poop goes. But how much dog owners, companion people, care about where their poop is and the politics of not picking up your poop and how angry the poop can get. But then pee doesn't have that same kind of politics. But it stains sidewalks and it creates this garish thing. And I keep finding myself worried about it because I think waste, unfortunately, historically has shown us that it can be a very powerful tool to exclude animals. This is what was used to exclude horses from cities, cows from cities, numerous animals from cities. Once they become associated with disease or waste and those connections, the capacity to push them or justify pushing them from the city becomes useful. And I find myself increasingly worried that waste and dog pee stains and poo are going to be used as these justifications to push dogs out of cities. Anyway, just a random reflection for me and / anxiety where I think I'm like, oh my word.
Well, I think it's already happening on a small scale, right? I mean, I grew up, I just remember my childhood home. And if you sit at the dinner table and look outside, you are literally looking at a sign that says no dogs. Because I grew up across from a park and it just says this park is not allowed for dogs. And the pure reason is, of course, their waste. So I think you're making a good point. It is already excluding them to some extent.
It definitely creates a different joke. And I think the size difference, I definitely think there's some cities now that are creating laws where certain size dogs are not allowed in cities anymore. Maybe it's to do with the size of their poops. I doubt it. I think it's a fear response. But anyway, I couldn't help but just think waste. This is a waste that's very pronounced in my life. I pick up poop every day. I see pee every day. I'm okay. Yeah.
Well, Claudia, I also have thought about this. There's not very much space in the cities for dogs to do their business. And when there is a plant bed, obviously, maintenance requires that dogs don't pee on them all the time, of course. So, they have to discard of their waste in such undignified ways. And I kind of find it funny whenever I see dogs looking embarrassed doing it on a concrete. But also this brings up the idea that waste is made visible through accumulation. And that also made me think that was also what I thought about a lot in your episodes, specifically with the pigeons and how, one hair is not necessarily a problem, but it's just the accumulation of all these hairs around the foot that eventually does cause a problem. And then obviously with waste in general, it's when you have too much of it that it's rendered a problem. Too much of animals in one space, they're rendered as waste as a collective. Yeah, so that was something that was constantly coming up for me.
Yeah, good point. I hadn't even thought about that, but I guess you're right. The more waste there is, the more of a problem it is. Probably because we have this idea that waste should be invisibilized because we are modern people. We don't have to sit with our waste. And the more waste there is, the more visible it becomes, the more of a problem it is.
Yeah. And of course, that's also attached to all of these ideas we have about health, human ideas of health. And again, what we think of as waste might not be waste for the animals involved. So, the accumulation of urine on a street corner, we might view it as waste, it's pee on a street corner. But for dogs, this is a really important communication device. For many animals, they're signaling to one another using what we would think of as a bodily waste, a urine or poo, or these are communication devices oftentimes, and not waste at all. Or maybe I don't want to overstate it either, right? Because I do think that animals do want to get away from their poo. But yeah, it's definitely interesting, this idea of accumulation, that the more it is. And then of course you want to go to a waste site, a dump site where there is it is a wasted and waste space, but you see so many animals in dump
Yeah,
sites, right? So like people don't want to see it. It's invisible. It's removed from urban spaces, but animals are there in abundance.
true. Yeah, I once spoke to someone at a conference, and it's a shame that I've forgotten his name, but he did research, I think, in the Czech Republic, where he went to landfills, and he actually had this hypothesis that birds would pick up waste at a landfill and fly much further inland, far away from the landfill, to drop the waste there to eat it. But that would create almost micro waste ecosystems, as they regularly did this. So far away from this landfill, you would find pockets of concentrated waste where multiple animals would walk around, like wild boars, birds, rodents. Yeah, like diaspora waste almost.
That makes me think. I mean, another thing that just now while talking to you is also the mobility of waste. It's not like it's a static. I think throughout all everything we're saying, it's not like it's a static thing. Waste has many meanings, but materially it also moves. Whether it's plastic that's being used in a fishing net that then gets dropped in the ocean and picked up by a current, or supposed trash in a heap in a dump site that's picked up by a bird and taken to a nest that's then picked up by the wind. It's got a big afterlife, right? It moves in so many dynamic ways that it's probably impacting many more animals than the animals you discussed who are impacted, than the sea turtle, than the pigeons or the house finches. It moves so much further than that, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah, I guess that would need an entire extra 30 episodes if you want to trace all the
Oh man.
mobilities.
Waste is there's so much you can do here with waste, and you did such a great job, but I think it's impossible to touch on everything. Rebecca, you wanted to say something there?
Yeah, I was just what you were mentioning there earlier, Claudia, is that like waste really is something that is so contained, or at least we want to contain it, and it really becomes such a problem mostly and only when it actually, is freed from whatever containment it's in. And that, like you mentioned earlier as well, gives it a very geographical and spatial sense, which, I've also been thinking about in my season with animals in design. And I do have a question for you, Herrick. If you were to have one more episode in your season and one more topic surrounding waste, what would you have explored?
Good question. I've had so many ideas. The first one that comes to mind is, I think I read somewhere that they were feeding Christmas trees to goats, specifically after Christmas, or maybe Claudia told me this, I'm not sure, but I thought that was fascinating, which sounds really silly, but I really like goats.
I don't think it's silly. Like all of these practices say something, right? Like why? I mean, it says something. They say it says something interesting, right? Like the kind of a lot of people are trying to create these like circular economies where there is no waste, right? Where waste does get picked up and used and mobilized in efficient / less damaging ways. And I think every time you bring up one of these examples, it opens a really interesting opportunity to think about our relationships, right? So there's nothing silly about it at all, I think.
Yeah, maybe for a Christmas special. I
Yeah,
don't know.
maybe.
Also, Rebecca, I had a question for you as well, and I don't want to like steal stuff away from your upcoming season, but did you encounter um, any intersections between waste and design with animals?
Yeah, for sure. I almost feel like we could have done a combined season just because, for example, the creative uses that birds have regarding waste. I had no idea that finches were using cigarette butts in their nests. And to me, that's an act of design as well, where you're creating a atmosphere. It's aromatic to them, right? You mentioned they were using aromatic flowers before they discovered that cigarette butts might actually even work better. So that to me is actually an act of design. And I was exploring that with magpies and how they are using also a waste material technically to anti-bird spikes and barbed wire and cloth hangers, for example, to build their nests. That could have also belonged in your season, but discussed in a different way. And another major intersection I found was how as we mentioned before, dealing with waste when it comes to animals is also an act of engineering the ecosystem a lot of the way. So you discussed that with worms and the fiddler crabs, and I thought that was also those were also acts of design. They're altering their environments, the physical spaces around them. I was so shocked to hear that the crabs actually dug burrows into the ground to withstand the waves that are crashing in, or whatever other reasons that you also discussed. But it was so fascinating. Like they're all designers in the ways they deal with waste. And we design a lot of things around waste as well, both to exclude waste, but also to manage it. So, yeah, your season really helped to inform how I thought about my season as well.
I can't wait to hear your season.
Yep, it will be coming up in 2025. And guys, I think this has been a really, really great conversation. I think we've just touched the surface of the waste issue. I mean, we've highlighted it, which is the goal of this podcast. But there's of course so much more to talk about with regards to waste. So maybe I'll come back for season 2.0 at some point, Hera. And before we close, is there anything else that you think we've missed? Any core theme or tension that you think we haven't yet discussed?
I don't think so. I think we got through more than I expected, actually. I loved hearing your thoughts. So, no, don't think
Rebecca,
so.
any final thoughts?
I
No?
feel the same way. That was such a productive conversation. I'm so glad to see you all.
Yeah, it's. I'm really happy that the fellowships are panning out, and you two have worked really wonderfully together. Since, I mean, it was supposed to be like a 2-month or 3-month fellowship, and it's gone on for a year now. So, I'm really, really delighted to have had both of you as fellows with the Animal Turn, and to have learned from you. And I know you've both got pretty exciting stuff happening. But perhaps, Hera, let's talk a bit about you. Where are you now with the PhD process? What are you currently working on? And if listeners want to get in touch with you more about waste, and maybe you've got a podcast, tell us a little bit about that. So give us a little bit of a Hera synopsis before we close.
Good point. Yeah, I am in the terrifying step of finishing up my PhD, and I'll be looking for probably postdocs after. So if you know something, I'm very open. You can reach me on X or Twitter at Herre de Bondt. It will be linked on the Animal Turn website as well. And apart from that, I'm co-editing a book that will be coming out with UCL on animal feeding, and it will probably be great. No, I've read it. It will be great. So you can look at my Twitter for that as well.
You're too modest. It will be great. And of course, you've been part of a whole project focused on animal feeding, which, I mean, again, I think it's interesting that you're focused on a project on animal feeding, and you decided in this season to focus on waste. And that kind of shows some of these tight connections between food and waste. And I think that's really quite fascinating. You are you still continuing your podcast on animal feeding?
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. We might be continuing. It was with Virginia, actually, who
Another fellow, yeah.
exactly. And we might be continuing it at some point, but for now there are no plans to continue it. I have learned so much during this fellowship that if we were to continue it, I feel like the difference between season 2 and season 1 would be enormous in terms of quality. But yeah, if I continue it, you'll hear about it.
Awesome. Well, I'll put a link in the show notes anyway, so that people can find out more and listen to the content that already exists, because it's such an important theme. It's a key relationship, humans and animals and feeding relationships, I think, is really pivotal important. So good luck as you finish up the final bits of your PhD. It's going to happen at lightning speed from now. You're going to all of a sudden be done and be like, what? Now I'm a doctor? What does that even mean? But you're going to be great. Good luck with the defense and everything. And it's been a real delight having you as a fellow with the Animal Turn. So thank you so much for joining us. Rebecca, I'm going to leave the final word with you, just so that you can also have a bit of an opportunity to plug your season. There will be more animal highlights before your season launches in 2025, but why not give listeners a little bit of a taste? Tell us a little bit about you and some of the work you do and what they can expect with the Animal Highlight in 2025.
Sure, Claudia. I don't want to steal the spotlight for too long, but I am a landscape architect and I'm based in New York City. And my forthcoming animal highlight season is called Animals as Designers or Animals and Design. I'm not quite sure of the title quite yet. And essentially, I'm trying to explore how animals are designers, how our design affects them, and how animals just change the physical environments around them and make really cool designs. So it'll be some investigations of our relationships with them at the intersection of design, but also just some cool animal designers just doing really cool things, and maybe they have nothing to do with us. So
So just a celebration sometimes of animals and the cool things they do.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is really
Exactly.
cool. Well, thank you, Rebecca, and it's been great having you join the team once again. Your artwork has made a huge change, I think, to the presence of the Animal Turn on social media. Okay, Hera, Rebecca, I've been chewing your ears off. Thank you so much for all of your hard work with the Animal Turn. Hera, thank you for a fantastic season with Animals and Waste. I look forward to seeing what you do in future. And a final thank you, everybody, for listening to the Animal Highlight and supporting the show. Remember to leave a review or rate the show. It's still kind of new on the airwaves, so share it if you think it's useful. It's a much more accessible medium. It's short, it's sharp, and it's really interesting. So if you've got it in you to share or rate or review, I very, very, very much appreciate it. Thank you once again to Hera for being an incredible co-host this season. I learned so much from him. Thank you to Rebecca Shen for her amazing artwork. And a huge thank you to Christiaan Mentz, who helps me with editing both this content and content found on the Animal Turn podcast. And a huge thank you to you listeners for tuning in, for listening, for sending us reviews and your thoughts and ideas. We very, very, very much appreciate it. And just like that, that's a wrap. Season 4 is done. Thank you so much for joining me. This is The Animal Highlight with me, Claudia Hirtenfelder.